Very good night and welcome to this special program. Today is International Day concerning the truth of concerning gross human rights violations and the dignity of victims. This special program today we're looking at human rights in Guyana. We're discussing that potential issue concerning individuals and the state and our collective community where human rights is concerned. In fact, earlier today, interestingly, a group of us, as you guys know, the Calvin Harding case is ongoing, and a group of us were there picketing outside of the Providence Magistrates Court, as that case is being called. Calvin Harding and Tiffany and Tanisha are responding to the charge of assault and disorderly conduct, even though they were victims of a gross human rights violation. So today, the 24th, we are observing the significance of Calvin Harding case in our community, but also talking about the broad issue of violence and sexual violence, particularly in gross human rights violations. I'm Norwell Hinds, and I'm joined in studio by, to my extreme right, Ms. Danuta Radzik of Help and Shelter. To her left, Mr. Joel Simpson of Sasad, Students Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination. Mr. Freddie Kissoon, an activist who is known to us and who writes in the Kaicho Paper. This evening, I want to pose a question, the first question to our panelists. And that question is, considering the significance of today, that is the international observance that we are commemorating now, what would you say are some of the biggest human rights issues facing Guyana? I can start with you, Joel.
I think systemic discrimination, Norwell, in the sense that there are particular groups and particular areas of discrimination which are so widespread and are so deep-rooted that they affect either small groups of people, small minorities, or they affect large groups of people in the country. I think the violence, the pandemic of violence against women in Guyana is a manifestation of systemic discrimination against women. There's discrimination against racial minorities, sexual and gender minorities. So we see discrimination on the grounds of sex, gender, race, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And I think some of those forms of discrimination are so pervasive and so deep-rooted that they qualify as systemic discrimination. And I think that's a major challenge that we need to address in Guyana.
Danuta.
Yes, well, I think Joel covered a lot just now. I would just like to highlight two other issues which I think he didn't quite mention, and that is violence against children. Very often we forget children, one, because of their vulnerable status, they very often cannot represent themselves, and so are at the mercy of adults, caregivers, and people who are supposed to look after them, to represent them, to protect them, and ensure their safety, etc. The other issue that I think needs a lot of attention in Guyana is the whole issue of trafficking in persons, because I really do not think we have the mechanism set up to deal with it, to address it and deal with it in a way in which survivors of trafficking in persons are able to enjoy and have their rights defended as citizens.
Freddie?
Well, I would want to collapse what Joel and Danuta have said and put it in the framework of total social collapse. When we in political theory speak about a failed state, one has to understand that the concept of a failed state doesn't mean that the streets are deserted, the banks are closed, etc. That is not what is meant by a failed state. I mean, if you go into Mexico, you will see fantastic developments. You will see huge banks. You will see nightclubs open, etc. And people, millions of people taking the subway, etc. That doesn't mean that the society hasn't got serious fundamental problems. In Mexico, the state is criminalized, where you can't trust any person in uniform. You can't trust any soldier. Now, in Guyana, we can speak, and I think the person that has coined that term is Professor Clive Thomas, the criminalization of the state. I would say in Guyana, when speaking about human rights, we have had a systemic collapse of this society. And to adumbrate on that would take some time, but the adumbration would put us in a category by ourselves when you look at what is going on in the world. I think since the election of Obama and since the tragedies of places like Rwanda, the international community is more sensitive to intensive and extensive violation of human rights in countries around the world. But I think Guyana escapes because it is not a Jamaica or a Barbados that are more popularly known in international circles. I mean, once you call the name Jamaica in any way in Beijing or Belgium or Monaco, people know what is Jamaica. If you go to China and you say Guyana, they don't know where is Guyana. And I think the systematic violation of people's rights, whether gays, whether you belong ethnic communities, the criminalization of the state, the total disrespect for the police by the police of the society, the uncouth behavior of the leaders in government, I think constitute a phenomenal breakdown in this country. And that has terrible implications for the human rights environment.
And I suppose for collective groups, for the total society. But are there particular groups that seem to be affected? I know you highlighted several, and Danuta, you spoke about women and children in particular. You spoke about trafficking in persons. Do you want to elaborate on some of how it is that those groups are affected?
Well, I think they, unfortunately, in Ghana, I mean, I'm not sure Ghana is a failed state at the moment, but there certainly are huge problems in the society. And what happens with women and children is that there are laws, and I think this is one of the problems we have in Ghana, is that when we compare Ghana with many other countries in the world, our laws are pretty okay. We have, laws that deal with issues of human rights and women's rights and children's rights, etc. But the problem is not so much that we don't have laws, but the problem is the enforcement of the laws, right? So, yes, on paper, things can look good. It can seem as if categories of persons have rights, but if the laws are not implemented in the way in which they're implemented, in fact, those laws don't amount to very much. And when the laws are violated, then that leads to serious abuses within the society. So, three laws. Let's look at three laws. Domestic Violence Act. That law needs reviewing. The Sexual Offences Act, which is a recent act, and so on. That also needs implementation, because there are some aspects of that law that have never been implemented, or they are not, because of problems with how that act got started and got enacted. For example, even though the Sexual Offences Act was passed in 2010, it really only became enforceable in relation to one of the pillars of that act, which was the paper committals, right? That, in fact, between 2010 and the beginning of this year, right, was not, in fact, able to be enforced because the drafters knew and people who had something to do with that act knew that there was a possibility that it would be challenged constitutionally, and it did happen, and therefore, even though it was a very new act, an amendment had to be made to that act to allow the paper committals to go through. So we have
Just
issues.
for our audience, what is a paper committal? What is that?
Okay, a paper committals is a mechanism in the act wherein the prosecution, right, and the defense have to present their statements, their evidence to the magistrate, and that evidence is also shared between prosecutor and so on. The magistrate then would look at that evidence and based on the evidence make a determination, right, as if there are grounds for, grounds that an offense had been committed, and therefore that case now would go to the High Court, to judge and jury, right? Prior to that, under the old laws that dealt with sexual offenses, it was a two-tier process. So first of all, you had to have a PI, a preliminary inquiry, at the magistrate's court, which could take up to maybe 3 years, 4 years. And then at the end of that, the magistrate would determine if there was enough evidence for it to go to High Court. Then it would go to High Court, and then the actual trial will start. And that process could take between 6, 8, 5 years, etc. And so the paper committals, and when the new Sexual Offences Act was put into effect, and it's a very good law, it was trying to resolve that problem of long delays, etc. in court, and in which what happened is that survivors of those offenses very often would drop out of taking their case through the courts because of long delays and a number of other things. It was not just long delays, but there were a number of other aspects of the way the old law was rolled out and the new law addressed.
Joel.
If I may, I think
particularly you spoke about systematic issues of discrimination, and I want you to address, if you could, the concern that Danuta raised about time delays as well.
Right. So, I mean, we know the maxim is not just a legal one, it's a popular one, but people say at the time, justice delayed is justice denied. So that's a problem, that people can have a case going through court for an experience or a crime that might have been perpetrated against them 5 years ago, 8 years ago. And that in itself is an issue in the justice system that needs to be resolved. We keep hearing about backlog of cases, we keep hearing about delays and failure in the judicial system to take cases through the process in a timely manner. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed at the level of the judiciary especially. In terms of the laws and legal protection, there's one major exception to the point that Danuta made about particular groups enjoying good legal protection, at least in law, if not in practice in Guyana. And that's sexual and gender minorities, particularly same-sex practicing men and transgender people. I think it's the only group, the only minority group who faces discrimination, whose behaviors are criminalized in that way. Because we have laws which make it illegal for men to express any form of intimacy between each other in private as consenting adults, and also laws which criminalize cross-dressing. So particularly for same-sex practicing men and transgender people, they are starting at a point where not only is the discrimination driven by the society, by social and cultural norms, and so on. It's also institutionalized because it's in the law. So you already have an issue there with equality before the law, because the law in effect says that these particular groups of people, this minority group, they're unapprehended criminals. So they start from a very, very unequal place when it comes to legal protection in Guyana.
Freddie.
Well, I don't think we have laws that are comparatively speaking, superior to any other country. I think our laws are very straightforward when you examine the international community. I mean, what we have, as Danuta say, is the lack of enforcement of these laws. And therefore, it points to a breakdown in the state. It is the state that have to enforce laws. But before I go, let me say there's one exception in Guyana. I haven't done the research, but I am not sure that there's another country where a constitution or a system of laws prevent a coalition. I mean, Guyana must be the only country where parties that contest an election after the election cannot collate. I believe our constitution is very, very negatively unique in that respect. But there are other backward laws that when you compare us to the rest of the world, we're particularly primitive. I mean, take, for example, the 1931 law on divorce. That is still the law of the land, where you have to give a judge 3 explanations in order to get a divorce. And if those 3 explanations don't exist in the marital home, you have to lie to the judge and say it exists. Domestic abuse, desertion, and infidelity. I mean, those are some of the things that put us way below other countries. I think another aspect of our country that other countries are very careful about is that senior public servants and senior state officials cannot join political parties and participate in elections. I think we've had the unique case where in the world, the vice chancellor of our own university was a political candidate for the ruling party. But let's leave that aside. I mean, what we have here, as I will use as my framework for the rest of the evening, is the total breakdown of society. When you compare us to Guyana, some of the things that go on,
Compares to whom?
when you compare us to the rest of the world, there are certain things that even in military dictatorships, look, I don't believe in Iran or in Cuba. The president of any one of those countries, and I believe Iran and Cuba are authoritarian system, and I could go through the military dictatorships in Central America and Africa and Asia. If a president treats his wife that way, refuse to legalize the marriage, that would have implications, serious implications for his presidency. I don't think he could survive. Okay. Those are some of the things that put us way below other countries. But let us concentrate now on other aspects. I believe the fundamental problem of this country in terms of human rights that is going to bring it down in a very implosive and explosive way is ethnic discrimination. And this ethnic discrimination is becoming so graphically overbearing that if not taken care of by enlightened forces, we're heading for trouble.
All right. So let me just say then, because we're talking here about several things you guys have highlighted so far. We talked about the law. We talked about delayed processes, the criminal justice system. We talked about the state. How do these things relate to human rights? In other words, what is human rights? So to help our audience out there to understand what is human rights and how these issues relate to those things. The law, the criminal justice system, and the state.
Well, simply put, human rights could be described as basic entitlements to which every human being, regardless of your status, your nationality, and things like that you're entitled to. So whether you were born in Iran or Guyana and so on, these entitlements are universal in nature. In a modern conceptualization of human rights, there are other historical formulations I'm sure Freddie could tell us about, but in a modern conceptualization of human rights, we like to point to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as being a kind of a basic or founding document in modern times, which articulates what those basic rights are. There are about 30 of them, in essence. And some of the fundamental ones are the right to life, the right to equality and freedom from discrimination, the right freedom of expression, freedom of association, and things like that. Human rights could also be categorized into some broad categories like civil and political rights, and economic, social, and cultural rights. And recently we're talking about the discussion in human rights is about third generation rights in new areas which are developing, like environmental human rights and so on. Issues like the right to peace, right to development, and so on. Those are considered like third generation human rights. But the premise of it, the basic of it is that there are these basic entitlements that just being born a human being, you have them. And no state, no government, nobody can tell you that you don't have these basic entitlements. You must have them by very nature of being human being. So now how that relates to law, for instance, is states have duties. We describe in human rights, we describe states as duty bearers. And states have duties to protect people's human rights. And one of the ways that the states are supposed to do that is by enshrining in law all these rights. So for instance, in the Guyana Constitution, there's an articulation of fundamental rights and freedoms. It starts in Article 40, and then there's a special section which lists and details all of these fundamental human rights and so on in the context of the Constitution of Guyana. At the level of international law, these rights are articulated in many treaties. And 7 of those treaties are directly a part of Guyana's constitution. With the amendments made in 2003 after the constitution reform process, what the state did was to make all of these major conventions, 7 of them in particular, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and so on, make that a direct part of the Constitution. So citizens can access these rights at the level of the state. They don't need to go to international mechanisms directly, right? So in the local courts, you could refer to these international agreements that the state has signed on to, because they're now directly a part of Guyana's Constitution.
You want to add anything, Danuta?
Well, just that I think that what you normally have taking place is that you have the laws, you have the kind of ideal there, and what should take place and what should protect you in terms of the law and so on. But the practice of the law, the implementation of the law, that is where persons are not able to exercise their rights and get justice as they should based on these laws because of lack of enforcement, etc. And I certainly agree with Joel in relation to when he spoke about gays and lesbians and transgendered people and so on, because in Ghana we do know that that is the group in which there really are no laws presently that offers them protection. And I do remember a few years back when there was a lot of discussion going on in society about the Constitution and so on and fundamental rights. And I think there was even a commitment made by the then President Jagdeo that in relation to things that persons should not be discriminated against should be sexual identity. Unfortunately, what happened is that kind of promise, and I think persons assumed that this would be placed into that constitution, which says that no one should be discriminated on the basis of sex and gender and religion and ethnicity, etc. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And I do think it is one of the areas in Guyana that needs particular attention, because in relation to the rest of the world, not all the countries of the world, but more and more we are seeing that persons have that right, right? They have that right to their own sexual identity, and it should be protected under the law.
Just one correction for the record, though. It was actually the Parliament that unanimously passed the Constitutional Amendment Bill in 2001, which included sexual orientation as discrimination.
Okay.
And
Yes.
President Jagdeo did assent to the bill under pressures from sectors of the religious community and sent it back to Parliament. It came up back in 2003, and then it was shelved because nobody wanted to vote on it.
Okay.
Right,
So
so-
today we are discussing as well gross human rights violations. What is a gross human rights violation? I'll start with you, Freddie.
Well, the word gross denotes the egregious or insufferable or bestial nature of the wrong act. The fact that you use the word gross. Or one can probably add on that and say by gross, one means a just barefaced, unthinkable violation of a right enshrined thousands of years ago to which one is entitled to. And by gross, I would define it as the totally unacceptable violation of a right a human being is entitled to, that is done in a way that is a vexation to civilized being. I mean, if a police just harass you for a couple of hours, he has no right to do that, but that's a violation of your right. But to throw you in prison for 3 days on a simple traffic offense, I think that is exceeding the limit of civilized right. And I think our violations in Guyana could aptly and sociologically be described most beyond dispute as most gross.
Joel, you want to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with Freddie, and I think also gross human rights violations refer to human rights violations which are so serious that they're of a particular kind, of a particular nature. One, I think when they involve large numbers of people, a violation which affects a significant proportion of the population. So if you have things like genocide, slavery, extrajudicial killings, where a large number of people have been killed and that sort of thing, those I would consider gross human rights violation. When a particular violation occurs on top of another, so for instance, where there's systemic discrimination, whether it's against women, racial minorities, indigenous people, sexual minorities, whoever it might be, and then on top of that systemic discrimination, you have a particular targeting of individuals or minority groups because they fall into those categories. I would consider those gross as well because they're facing amplified violations there. So it's discrimination, and on top of it, it's targeted violence by police, right? Police brutality against sex workers, for instance, or against trans people, because we have a law against cross-dressing as an example, or against black youth in working class neighborhoods, because racial discrimination exists in the society. And police are targeting youth who are on the streets, who are in vulnerable circumstances, and so on. So I think that's another category of gross human rights violation. I think also where a violation is perpetrated by the state, it could be a gross human rights violation. Why? Because the state is the duty bearer. The state has a mandate to protect your rights. So now when agents of the state are violating your rights, that makes it totally gross, in my opinion, because this is the agency. You're supposed to be relying on these bodies to protect your rights. So, for instance, the police. So issues of like police abuse, police torture, and things like that. I would consider them gross human rights violation because the police is an agent of the state and they're charged with your protection and your security.
Do you want
Yes.
to add to that?
Yeah, so that in fact, even if Joel, as Joel has said, sometimes gross refers to numbers of persons, but you can also have gross violation against one person. And in Guyana right now, I mean, we've had two well-known cases, and one is Taiwan Thomas, and the other one is Colwyn Harden, which is a current case. Going back to something that Joel also said about the state as duty bearers and having the responsibilities to protect its citizens and the rights of its citizens. And this is something that organization that I'm representing here, Help and Shelter, we have brought it to the attention of the Chancellor. And that is, and coming back to the Sexual Offences Act, is that the so-called New Sexual Offences Act, which was came into effect in 2010, right? What that means is that any sexual offenses that takes place, or took place at that period of time and going onwards would fall under that new law. However, there were a number of cases, because as I spoke about the huge delays in getting these cases finished, processed, etc. There are a large number of persons in Guyana who still have not heard their sexual offences cases have not been completed, right? And I am not sure what's happening to that, right? And what we have to understand in Guyana is that the majority of persons who experience sexual offenses are children. So we're talking about children, babies, 4-year-olds, 5 up, up to 17. I know for us at my organization, we have about 7 or 8 cases, right, which fall under the old act. And what happened is that because magistrates move very often, some of them leave the bench, new ones come on, etc. So we had cases, right, which had already started. In some instances, the survivor had actually given her or his evidence, etc. And those cases, because the magistrate left the jurisdiction, had to be started over. So we are talking about some cases which are, I think they must be like 5 or 6 years, and this is still in the magistrate's court. It has not even been sent on to the High Court. And I believe that, and those are cases that we know about, but there have to be lots of other cases in the system. And what is happening to those children, I consider that also a gross violation. And right now, the state, right, the judiciary and so on, they have to find a mechanism to ensure that those children, those cases, if they need to get extra magistrates on, etc., it needs to be done. They need to be able to go to court and have their cases finished within as short a period as possible, right? And unfortunately, right, besides that, that is something that needs to be done. But even the new Sexual Offences Act, it started with a backlog of over 100 cases, because when paper committals were not possible, rape cases, which and the more serious sexual offenses cases could not go through, so they were piling up also on one another. And as I said, something needs to be done about the justice system in Guyana.
Okay. Now you mentioned 2 particular cases, and I'm glad in the definition that you gave of those human rights violations that you alluded to, or in fact said, that torture on the individual level is considered a gross human rights violation. And you mentioned 2 particular cases, one which is more recent, which is the Colwyn Harden case, and the other case concerns Toyon Thomas, who we know, and in Toyon's case, as you might remember from 2008, his genitals were burnt. or his genitalia was burned in 2008 by the police. Freddie, it seems as if they're mentioning and referring to those two cases that I just mentioned, Colvin and Mr. Thomas. It seems as though there has been the use of sexual violence as part of torture. Why is that so? And how do you account for that in this broad conversation about human rights?
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, the guy's reproductive parts was burnt, and then Colvin was sodomized. I think it has to do. One has to be very careful here on these programs what one say, because you don't want to get the station into trouble. But I think over the past 10 years, there have been such a breakdown in the moral foundation of power. Let me digress for a while and go back to the origin of human rights. I know of no philosopher, absolutely none, that have separated the evolution and continuation of human rights from the state. The state and human rights is like match and a cigarette. From the time Plato wrote his Republic, right up to John Rawls' writing on justice and the establishment of the United Nations, etc., human rights and the state go hand in hand, because society has to find a mechanism to enforcing rights and providing justice. And Plato may have called it the philosophy king class. Hobbes may have called it the Leviathan. International society in the 20th century may have looked to the UN. But the state has to provide the canopy for the preservation of human rights. What is happening in Guyana with Thomas' theory of the criminalization of the state? I believe that in the past 10 years, the state has become so debauched and so immoral that a whole series of depravities have crept in to the exercise of power and the contempt of society, that it involves sexuality. And I believe that certain key actors in the state have so promulgated these sexual depravity practices that it has become infectious in state enforcement agency. I'll just give you one example where a young man who's on the Rights of the Child Commission has been exposed as someone that is a predator. Now, I think those kinds of depravities have crept into the exercise of power, and therefore you find sexual dimensions to the violation of human rights. That, for me, is the explanation of the emphasis on sexual outcomes in the process of torture. But we may know of the Colvin Hardin case, and we may know of the Thomas case. I was a group of us from the People's Parliament. We went up to Puerto Rico, and you should hear what those vendors have to say when they're putting them up, when they're running them and telling them they're illegal vending. You should hear the sexual abuse that they have to put up with. So this is a new pathology that has entered into the human rights violation arena. And I don't have the answer, I just attempted one. But I think we have to definitely confront it before it gets worse.
Now, we started earlier by talking about trafficking in persons, particularly. And when we talk about sexual violence, I think that becomes one of the issues that undoubtedly we have to look at. There have been reports of women who have to, even though they're in the custody of their captors, are forced to give sexual favors so that the captors could pass freely with them at blockades. How do you account for that sort of practice as well?
Yes, well, for trafficking, there are types of trafficking. So there's sexual slavery, there's like sexual exploitation that you will have. There's a trafficking in terms of labor, exploitation of labor. You know, so there are different categories of trafficking, and I would say for Guyana, exploitation of labor definitely exists, and definitely sexual exploitation of women, and many of them young women who are lured, because that is the whole nature of trafficking in person, is that they are fooled, they are tricked, they are lured to other locations from which they live or where they're working for better gain, improvement, you know, financially, etc., etc. What tends to happen is when they get there, it is not as was explained to them, or it was not what were their expectations, and very often they are then forced to perform work, be it labor, unwaged labor, or perform sex work, very often unpaid. The persons who house them and you know, look after them, they collect the money. So you know, it's forced. It's as they say, a form of slavery, modern day slavery. That is what trafficking in persons is. And there are a number of cases which we know about, mainly through the Guyana Women Miners Association, because they have been going actually into interior location and actually rescuing girls, etc. However, one of the problems with that is that once rescued, what happens? Once again, we do have a trafficking in persons law, which has been in effect, I don't know, years now, but how many convictions have we had? You know, how many convictions? And just recently, I think it was in Sunday's newspaper, Simona Brooms, who's the head of the Guyana Women Miners Association, was interviewed, and she expressed her, you know, her amazement and you know, concern about the one case, about two cases. One in which the case was being dismissed because the young women who were trafficked did not get to court to finish giving their evidence, so the traffickers got off. The other case was where they actually they were charged and there was a conviction, but as she said, they were out within a year or two, which seems quite amazing to me, because if you read the Trafficking in Persons Act, for every violation, right, for every different set of exploitation, the number of years are added on. And I would have imagined that the persons who got out, not only did they have persons in their employ and they were not paying them, etc., but they were forcing them into some form of sexual slavery and exploitation, and that should have gotten added years to it. So I myself don't quite understand what is happening, but a big bright light needs to be shone on trafficking in persons in Guyana, because those two cases mentioned, right, it seems to me it is such a violation of the rights of those young people who went through, who had to experience all of that trauma and denial of human rights, and at the end of it, you know, no one is responsible. Those responsible for those acts have not received punishment, and justice was not done.
Joel, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think we're hearing a common thread, Norwell, about justice and the inability of survivors and victims of all kinds of human rights violations to access justice. Danuta spoke very eloquently about survivors of sexual violence and the problems they've had accessing justice under the Sexual Offences Act. Children, the issue of children, on their inability to access justice as survivors of sexual violence, some people growing up and moving on and so on. And now the issue of persons who have been trafficked. So it seems to me that a huge part of the problem we have with human rights is people's ability to access justice. And the problems in the criminal justice system and the justice system generally are so major that they warrant, I think, particular attention and a whole range of remedies, which we can't even begin to examine in just a short program. But that is a huge part of it, because if people can't get justice for the violations they suffer, then the perpetrators will continue to mete out these violations. They will continue to abuse people. They'll continue to discriminate against people. And that's how a situation of impunity occurs, when people feel that they can commit these human rights violations and get away with it scot-free without any kind of punishment. And I think in a situation, that in itself is a gross human rights violation.
Oh, yes.
Right?
So tell me then, you're from organizations, well, except Freddie. Well, you are from an organization.
But can I just, sorry about this, Norwell, but coming back, because I know you started to ask about the police and trafficking. And in fact, yes, there are certainly two cases. One, in fact, where a policeman, it was in the newspaper, a policeman was identified as actually trafficking someone in this society. And secondly, where police would force, right, persons traveling through checkpoints, right, force them into having sex with them.
And it was
before
a case of a police officer who actually had sex with a young girl.
Exactly, before allowing them in, and then on top of that, went to the location where those girls were working as sex, being sexually exploited, and demanded free sex once again.
So what do we do next? What you're from organizations, each of you. What are you doing? What can the ordinary person do?
Well, one kind of immediate thing is we'd like to hear from people who are affected, people in the community who are concerned. So on Sunday, the participating organizations, Red Thread, Help and Shelter, Sasad, and the Calvin Harding Support Group are hosting a public forum on the use of sexual violence in gross human rights violations. And that's happening at the auditorium of the St. Stanislaus College on Brick Dam from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. And our intention there is to get information from the community, to get views of the public, and to develop an action plan about how organizations and citizens can work together to address some of these problems. We definitely need to get the attention of the policymakers. We definitely need to get the attention of state officials. But I think this scourge has become so endemic that people also need to get up and tackle it. So that's one very immediate thing that people listening to this program, people who are interested in these issues can do, which is come out to the public forum on Sunday and participate.
Joel, I don't want I don't want the program to end because without a particular thing that has been on my mind for a couple of years, and this is based on my journalistic investigation, and I think I owe it to Sasad to bring it up. I believe the police are totally callous when it comes to brutal murder of homosexuals. There have been at least 5 of them, and the police have not pursued with any vigor. I remember when there was the Tiffany murder. Tiffany used to pass by the People's Parliament and speak very nicely to us. 2 nights after that murder, a group of us from the People's Parliament went to Tiffany's family, and the police did not take the cell phone and examine it. In modern forensic science, in modern investigation, that's the first thing you do with a murder victim. And I believe there is a very powerful person in this country, 1 or 2, that are brutally killing homosexuals. And you see the pattern, extreme trauma to the head, and there is one, the actor on the seawall. There is Adam Harris' stepbrother, who was killed yards away, where the police were guarding the GT&T cable that goes under the sea. I went the next day and asked the police if they heard anything. And then there's Tiffany. Now, if you look at all those investigations, the police incompetence is glaring. And I believe SASOD need to up the ante when it comes to police prejudice about investigating homosexuals' death.
You want to add, Danuta?
Yes, well, I think it starts with people knowing their rights and knowing their rights. So I think that a lot of education, and we have to get that information to people about their rights, about the laws, right, so that they are able to use those laws to defend themselves and to demand the justice that those laws, right, of the country and a citizen they are entitled to, right? So we really have to educate and empower people. I think that's one of the things. The other thing that I think is really important too is that that people stand up for their rights and report. And there are some organizations, I know not enough and so on, but speak out, right, about injustice, right? Speak out about crimes, especially crimes against human rights. Find organizations, tell them about it, ask them for help, right? There are a number of organizations in this society who can lend some assistance, right? I also think that we also need to ensure and support persons who are fighting for human rights and justice in this society, right? We need to support them because it is difficult to battle through the legal system in Guyana. So they need support. And with support, when they are, with support, people stand a better chance, right, of getting justice. And this is what we need to see happen in Guyana. We need to see people whose rights have been violated getting justice. And the perpetrators, right, also being sentenced and getting justice, right?
Okay.
I think seeing
and of course,
that.
there's a current case with Colin Harding. And
Exactly.
The
That
AG
is why
recently announced that the state doesn't see any need for compensation.
Exactly. That is why. And I think it's maybe one of the little differences when we look at the Taiwan Thomas case and Colin Harding is that Colin has a larger support system around that. And I think there are a number of people who are very committed and are going to be there with him for the long haul, because we cannot allow that gross, right, violation, right, to go unanswered and unpunished in society.
I think that we are about at the end of the program tonight, but I hope that at least for the time that we were here, that we helped you to understand the issues of human rights in Guyana, and particularly gross human rights violations in Guyana and the use of sexual violence therein. Joel started to talk about reporting issues, and reporting issues become very critical. In fact, his organization chairs a group called the Guyana Equality Forum, and the Guyana Equality Forum is made up of Help and Shelter, Red Thread, and a number of other organizations working in the area of human rights. We will end this program by playing for you a public service announcement inviting you to submit issues and report issues of discrimination and human rights abuses to a SASOD organization which chairs this Guyana Equality Forum. This has been this special program looking at sexual violence and its use in gross human rights violations. I want to thank my guests, and I want to thank you for being a wonderful audience and for listening out there. Please enjoy this day, but also take responsibility and stand up in your own defense, the defense of human rights. Thank you.
What your friends wanna think if they see you hanging out with a queer. I am Danuta Nicholson, Secretary on the Board of Trustees of the Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, SASOD. People are afraid, but it's important to report discrimination and abuse. If not, we won't know what's happening to you. We at SASOD would like to help you.
And that's the reason why war can't cease if you know.
We refer you to psychosocial support, provide legal support in some instances. We also guide you towards healthcare services and accompany you to the police station if you need to make a report. It depends on the needs of the client or clients making the complaint to us.
Tell me, why can't you act?
It's important to make a report. You need the date, time, location, number and description of person or persons involved. And if a vehicle is involved, the license plate number as well as the color of that vehicle will be useful.
Tell me why.
SASOD is a human rights non-governmental organization. We take reports from everyone, male, female, bisexual, transgender, heterosexual, homosexual, people with disabilities, people living with HIV, everyone.